Well, welcome. I am glad to see a few people out there who are actually not participants in the conference. That means we have some public to ask questions. My name is Bev Young, and I'm an environmental engineer with the Forest Service. We have a regional office here in Missoula, which I work in, and I have been the asbestos program manager for the last 16 years concerning how we manage asbestos in our facilities. Since the Libby issue has arisen, I'm also pretty concerned about occupational exposures to asbestos due to potential silvicultural operations. So, in a sense, I consider myself the public as well because I have questions. I'm not a researcher, but I am constantly challenged to bring the information that we get from our researchers and apply it to our daily lives and our daily workplaces. So, I have some questions as well for the group. For those of you who are not part of the conference, I want you to know that those that we have with us today, the experts, some of whom are sitting up here, some are out in the audience. We will field questions via the index cards. Please write your questions down. But these people represent toxicologists, environmental scientists. I don't know if we have any of our government staff here from ATSDR, the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. They may have stepped outside for lunch. We also have EPA officials at the conference. We have medical doctors. We have a very prestigious group of researchers. So this is a phenomenal opportunity for us to ask questions of those who are most in the know. I would like to commend the conference organizers, these three people, minus him, for making sure that the conference is available to the public. It was a really a high priority of theirs to make sure that these researchers were accessible to the public for at least part of the conference. So my commendations to you for doing that. This session is being filmed by the Missoula Community Access Television via cable TV, and so it is being filmed, and we are not live, but we are on camera, and this will be broadcast at a later date. So just realize that your participation here, the back of your head may be filmed. If you choose to come up front to speak, the front of you may be filmed. We are asking that you write your questions down, and there are people who can pick up your index cards if you want to just hold them up. Somebody will come and pick them up and bring them forward. Now, if we have a question that arises and one of our experts is out in the audience, I would ask you please to come forward and take the wireless mic so you too can be on camera. We want more than the back of your head. Well, I'm going to start with a question. That's one that we get asked frequently, those of us who are in the role of translators of dealing with the public. EPA states there is no safe level of asbestos in dust. Please explain what that means. And also, as a second part, can one asbestos fiber cause disease? True or false? So, which expert would like to take on that question? Please explain. There is no safe level of asbestos in dust. Where are our EPA people when we need them? Right, our toxicologists. Where is Aubrey Miller or Chris Weiss right now? Well, nobody. We don't have our medical researchers in here right now. It looks like our medical doctors who are willing to state that. Okay, brave soul comes forward. Thank you. And for those of you who do answer the questions, please introduce who you are.
I'm Mike Spence. I'm a medical doctor. Prior to my retirement, December 31st, 2004, I was the Chief Medical Officer of the Department of Public Health. and one of the original group that went to Libya in November of '99. I ran the MASA program up until my retirement. Asbestos particles, the way they cause disease, one, I guess, could potentially theorize that one particle could cause disease and could be harmful. And so no level is safe if that's indeed the case. What actually happens is that asbestos particles, or the fibers, when they get into the lung, actually go between the cells through the intracellular spaces and out into the pleural cavity, that space between your lungs and your chest cavity. Once they get there, our bodies, if we have a good macrophage or immune system, recognize this as foreign matter, and hence they mount an immune response. That immune response constitutes pus cells coming there and trying to get rid of them. Just like if you got a splinter in your finger, that's a foreign body, what you see around that splinter is a collection of pus trying to get rid of that foreign body. And sometimes it will cause it to dissolve, sometimes it'll cause it to get out, but most commonly you open it up and drain it and get it out that way. Well, you can't open up and drain and get this asbestos fiber out of your chest cavity. The pus cells come there and they try and engulf or eat this foreign particle, this piece of asbestos. And so they surround it, they engulf it, and they release a lot of chemicals, enzymes, and peroxidases and other chemicals trying to cause it to dissolve and go away. Asbestos is very unique. It's inert to these chemicals and nothing happens. The end result is the pus cells, when they're trying to release these chemicals, they die. The asbestos is left there. So what happens? Another pus cell comes along and tries the same thing, repetitively, over and over and over again. Well, although it's not doing damage to this inert piece of asbestos fiber, these enzymes or peroxidases, these chemicals, are doing damage to the tissues inside the body. They are causing little scars on the area where they are attacking. So you're getting these pinpoint, microscopic, very minuscule little scars on your chest wall or on the wall of your lung. And what basically happens over a period of time is this process is repeated billions and billions of times over eons or years. We know that the latency period for asbestos-related disease is measured in decades. What we see is these scars coalescing and getting larger and larger until you get the fibrosis that we recognize as clinical disease.
I think there are two other factors that make it difficult to determine what the safe dose is. And one of them deals with what I talked about earlier. We don't really know what the exposures were 30, 40, 50 years ago that caused the diseases today. And the second is the laboratory studies that have been done, most of them up to date, have worked with asbestos that has not been well characterized. So we don't have a good idea of what the fiber size distribution was in the fibers that were used to elicit the different responses of the cells. So it's very fuzzy for that reason also.
Andrei Holian here at the Center for Environmental Health Sciences at the University of Montana. There is no, this is, as you suggested, this is a controversial topic. And there have been, this has been discussed in the literature. There was a whole series of articles that appeared in Science a number of years ago, and different groups that represent different points of view. I think just to segue off a little bit of what Mike said about this, it also has to do with what disease you're talking about as well, which may complicate the interpretation. Something like lung fibrosis, where it engulfs larger areas of the lung, one would kind of intuitively think that it must take at least a number of fibers to involve large areas of the lung to have this disease. If you look at another disease such as mesothelioma, theoretically, one fiber causing a mutation in one cell could get that and to proliferate and develop ultimately into a large tissue, mutated tissue area or a cancer. So I think that also complicates the interpretation, is what disease you're talking about. And again here, as we mentioned earlier in the conference, we're talking here about a number of diseases that may be involved. Well, with that cancer image I mentioned earlier, that it could take one fiber to cause one change in a cell, the body also has an immune system for detecting cells. So much like we travel in airplanes and we are exposed to cosmic radiation, we are getting mutations every time we take an airplane flight. Well, most often those are recognized and those cells eliminated. So there is going to be a balance. So there is, again, there's no clear answer. Theoretically, it could be possible, but I think for all practical purposes, it's probably more complex.
And I'm going to add to the complexity, and that is that people are different. How one person reacts to a fiber may be very different than how their neighbor reacts to a fiber. And so it's the combination, I think, of gene and environment interactions that plays a real role in how your particular body is reacting. And this may also play a role in which disease you develop after exposure to an asbestos fiber. Perhaps one person is going to develop a fibrosis, whereas another person with exposure to the same fiber and the same dose may develop a cancer, because perhaps their repair mechanisms or their mutated cell recognition mechanisms may be very different from one person to the other. And those are all areas that we are exploring in trying to understand these diseases a little better.
Good afternoon. My name is Jay Flynn, and I'm the medical director for the Libby Medical Program. That's the health benefit program that was put into place in April of 2000 for the people in Libby, Montana, who have asbestos-related conditions and illnesses. And I read the reports, medical reports, x-ray reports on our members day in and day out. And certainly in Libby, Montana, the big thing that we see are the pleural plaques. And I would like to just give another possible version as to how these pleural plaques are forming. And I think that what happens is that the patient inhales the asbestos fibers, and then they get down in the lung and they migrate out to the very working part of the lung, the alveoli, and they get into these little tiny airways. And we all know, as we're breathing here, our lungs act as a bellows, continually breathing day and night. And part of I think what happens is that this bellows effect carries these fibers out to the periphery of the lung. And the lung is lined by the parietal pleura. On the chest, by the visceral pleura. On the chest wall is the parietal pleura. And I think that what happens is these fibers make their way out through the visceral pleura, and now as you breathe with this bellows effect, they scratch the parietal pleura. And that's where the pleural plaques form. And as they scratch the pleura, scar tissue is laid down. And the scar tissue, when you look at it under a microscope, is just collagen fibers. There's very few cells in it, and it's very, very rare to even identify an asbestos fiber in it. So as it scratches, it forms this little piece of scar tissue, which becomes a pleural plaque. And I agree that everybody reacts different when their parietal pleura is irritated by these fibers. Most people form pleural plaques. Those whose mesothelial cells don't like this irritation do other things, and I think that's where the mesotheliomas come from. And I think it's a gene thing that regulates the mesothelial cells in the parietal pleura to determine what happens, who gets pleural plaques, who gets the mesothelioma, who gets the pleural thickening. Thank you.
It's not a simple answer. So when you have a group of people out there asking you, can one fiber kill, there's that possibility. I think if you look at the EPA literature, what I saw is EPA has a statement that says that there is no man-made material that they say has a lower limit of known acceptability if that is entered into our bodies. So, it's a caveat that we know that we are exposed to many environmental carcinogens, and because of the variability in people's, receptors, they will have a different way of reacting to that. Okay, another question. Vermiculite has been used since the 1940s as insulation in homes and other buildings. Is there any evidence of disease due to this non-occupational exposure? There certainly has been a sufficient latency period.
I'll begin this one. I think there are several people here that can address it as well. I'm Jean Pfau. I'm an immunotoxicologist here in the Center for Environmental Health Sciences. And my interest is really in a disease that hasn't come up in discussion yet, but will later, and that is in immune or autoimmune diseases. And I have the privilege of working with epidemiologists who are asking that very question and studying some of the research that's come out of Libby in particular, that has shown that that asbestos-related diseases are indeed environmental in addition to being occupational, and that environmental exposures, whether people used it in their gardens or used it as insulation or used it for a variety of activities, they are seeing disease in these individuals. So it is an environmental disease as well.
As to the question of whether or not vermiculite itself is a disease-causing agent, we do not know. What we do know is that because of the types of the disease that are developed after exposure to asbestos-contaminated vermiculite, which are the types of diseases that we are calling asbestos-related diseases, we assume that folks exposed to vermiculite are also exposed to whatever levels of contamination of asbestos that could potentially cause disease. Was that essentially what the question was? There are known just environmental cases of disease. There is a group of folks up in Manitoba where housing was built and insulated in vermiculite. It's a wonderful insulator. You can imagine in the far north it works very well. And there is a cluster of mesotheliomas associated with this community, and they are now investigating the vermiculite that is in those attics. And
Is there any vermiculite in the potting soil that I just bought about a week ago?
the question is,
Is that bad for me? Should I just throw it back and take it back to Walmart?
the question that was asked was, is there any asbestos in the vermiculite that was just purchased at Walmart last week? And the answer is, we don't know, but probably. The question is, what is the acceptable level of asbestos? And the vermiculite that you bought probably had, if it had asbestos contamination, it was below the level at which it would not be acceptable. So there are sources of vermiculite that are relatively free of asbestos, and those are those on the market today.
And I'm sure there's people that know more specifically than I do about this, but what I've heard is that most of the vermiculite that is currently marketed comes from mines in South Carolina and also Virginia. They state that the product is asbestos-free, and you probably know that the definition of an asbestos-containing material is one that has 1% or more, or is it more than 1%? I always forget where the 1% falls, but the point is, I guess from what I've learned, is that with the tremolite contamination of vermiculite, levels of 1% are still of concern to public health. And that's where my interest lies, because I've had a lot of vermiculite tested for asbestos content, and most of it comes back as non-asbestos containing material. That doesn't mean that I rest easy knowing that we have people living and working in buildings with that insulation. And I think this is what we see frequently now in the real estate market. You know, people are going out, they're looking at houses to buy. Oh, it's got vermiculite attic insulation. What do I do? You see a lot of properties sit on the market for a while now. Okay. Yes?
There are also 3 talc mines, as I understand it, down by Dillon. And based on what I heard earlier about contamination of talc, should we be worried or concerned about this, and also about the trees around these talc mines?
I can confirm for you that there are multiple talc mines in Montana. The state does have a map of all of the talc mines available. And I'm going to hand this off to a talc expert now.
People in the talc industry would say that I am not a talc expert. But the kind of talc that I was describing earlier is an unusual type of talc in that it was fibrous in its origin and remained fibrous in its final state. If the talc mines in Montana are platy talc, there probably isn't a problem.
So we would need to find out what type of talc it is then. Okay. I'm going to try to read this right. Do trees have immunosystems? Is that capturing it? If so, any thought on CEHS's immune expert studying the tree's response to amphiboles in their inner bark?
Thanks. That is a difficult question. The answer to the first part of the question, whether trees have immune systems, is probably no. As far as what we define an immune system in terms of being able to mount immunity against something would be no. They have a wound healing response, however, that's quite phenomenal if you've ever seen a tree be wounded and how it covers it over with new tissue. And so I'm sure that there is some kind of a response like that if the tree is wounded by the fibers. What we don't know is what a tree would constitute as a wound, and so you'd have to probably get a botanist in here to answer that question. In terms of researching what's going on in the trees, I think because the tissue would be so very, very different from anything we're dealing with human health, that we're focused very much on the human health aspect, and that would not be a model that would move us forward in terms of biomedical research. Certainly an interesting question, however.
Just to comment on that, I think that the research is just based on fibers sitting. I'm Mike Giese. I'm with the Card Clinic in Libby, but I also happen to be a forester with the Forest Service. And I think the research that was talked earlier by Tony dealt with fibers sitting in the bark, not embedded in the tree or in the inner bark. The inner bark's really the growing part of the tree. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, that it wasn't in the tree, so the tree's not actually trying to fight off this fiber.
To consult momentarily here to make sure I am reading properly. Excuse me. Why don't you say the question?
I had a second question, and that's on the assumption that asbestos has been measured in Libby's ambient PM 2.5 and ambient PM 10 monitors. Has there been any attempt to, I guess, back estimate what proportion of the asbestos concentration in the monitors comes from wood stoves and burning wood with asbestos?
Tony, did you hear that question?
I did not. Can you repeat the question? Can you say that one more time, Tony?
Basically, what is the evidence for fibers in the sampling?
And if so, have you back modeled the source of the amount of that asbestos that comes from burning wood and wood stoves?
Tony Ward, University of Montana, Center for Environmental Health Sciences. So the PM samples that we've collected, we have not analyzed for asbestos. For one, we don't have the right type of filter to analyze for asbestos. But the EPA has done a lot of asbestos, ambient asbestos monitoring. And I know they're in the process of reporting the results within the next month. So all the wood stove studies we've done are using methods strictly used for PM work, not asbestos.
short of peeling the bark off of these trees, is there another way? Could you wash these trees down and get the asbestos off of them?
Can you wash the trees down and get the bark, the asbestos off of them?
I'm thinking about buying them out there and selling them, making money.
That's one option, you know, rip off all the bark and take down all the trees.
And helicopter mine them so you don't stir up any dust in the process.
Exactly.
When you do your bark analysis, can you tell, you know, which fibers are on the most outer part of the bark versus which are on the inner? And with the bark, how is it related to the aging of the tree? Is the outer bark the oldest bark and the inner bark the youngest bark?
Right, I can answer the last part of that question. That's true, that the outside of the bark is just like skin. When it grows, it's the oldest is the outer, and it sloughs off. As far as the analysis,
We haven't gone to the extent of trying to discriminate where exactly on the bark the asbestos is. We were just doing a gross, take a chunk and analyze it. Certainly, one of the permutations we'll be looking at in the future is where exactly in this bark do we have the highest concentrations of fibers. From what I saw by the SEM, the high concentrations were hid in the nooks and crannies.
You know, when a dermatologist wants to check the skin, like you're checking the bark, he does a punch biopsy. Isn't there some kind of a tool or something where you can go up to a tree and just do a punch biopsy so you know, like you did your samples in the pond, you know, the oldest, the youngest, and where the fibers are?
I'll look at that.
For those of you who have not been involved in the discussions this morning, Tony Ward presented some research about the deposition of asbestos fibers on the tree bark in the area surrounding both the mine and outside of Libby, and the concentrations are very high. So there's a concern there, especially for those who log and who burn wood, and that's what's precipitating these questions. Okay. Are asbestos substitutes safer than asbestos are asbestos substitutes safer than asbestos in new products? So those products which have supplanted asbestos, are they any safer for us?
I can only address that as a researcher who, in trying to do our research, we're always looking for something that's basically a negative control. That is, something that we can add to our research experiments that we know will give us a negative answer. If we're asking, does this fiber cause inflammation, for example, we want something that we know will not do that. And the search for something that we can use as our negative control, as our safe fiber, has resulted in a great deal of frustration. And we've done a lot of reading in the literature trying to find those fibers that we can use as our negative control. And so far, we've been stymied by the fact that most of them do form some kind of an inflammatory response, and many of them, in fact, do cause fibrosis.
Have you studied fiberglass?
We have not looked directly at that, although I might direct that to some of the earlier studies. In my work, we haven't looked at fiberglass, but it is in the literature that it is actually has the potential to cause damage.
I think you have to look outside the laboratory setting and evaluate materials before you use them as controls, because the unique aspect of asbestos is its very narrow diameter that allows it to get into the deep lungs where only the macrophages can work with it. So if you're working with something that's not going to make it into the deep lungs, like fiberglass or wollastonite or some of the other minerals that are acting as substitutes, then I think that you're not really looking at the problem. So many of the substitutes that I'm familiar with do not have those properties that allow it to penetrate to the deep lungs, so they probably are not the problem that asbestos is, but I can't say that about all substitutes.
I think another characteristics that we have not touched base on is the durability of the fibers. If you were to look at the glass fibers, in tissue culture, they tend to induce inflammations, they induce phagocytosis. But when you get into the animal models, glass fibers, they do not persist as long as many of these asbestos, and so they tend to fade away, so to speak. Asbestos lasts forever, so that's why they produce this chronic inflammatory response, produce free radicals, and there's 5 or 6 mechanisms on how asbestos can induce tumors. And tomorrow in the mechanism section, we'll try to answer some of those as well.
You can still be writing questions and holding up index cards, and someone will come and pick them up, okay? What concerns does talc baby powder and also talc and foot powder have for exposure to asbestos?
Those are typically platy talcs, and they don't present the problems that we've seen with the fibrous talc.
However,
the use of talcum powder does present itself another problem, not related to asbestosis or mesothelioma, but there's a really large body of evidence demonstrating the use of talcum powder in powdering diaphragms and the development of ovarian cancer. A cancer that looks much like a mesothelioma.
that's interesting, because when I first came to work for the Forest Service, we had an individual there who had developed ovarian cancer, and she asked me, could this be due to asbestos exposure? And at the time, with my knowledge that I had, I said, I haven't seen that in the literature, but obviously there's the potential for some association there because of talc and the amphibole fibers. But also, now, so building on that issue of platy talc versus, I'm sorry, what's the other form? Fibrous. How many fibrous talc mines are there that are in production now, and what is fibrous talc used for?
Fibrous talc is used mostly in industrial applications, paint thickeners, for ceramics. So it's usually not in a form that's becoming aerosolized.
This question, you can ask a question. Is this question related to asbestos and crayons?
So you're asking a question now about asbestos content in crayons? Okay.
We looked at crayons, and there is, because they had the fibrous talc in there, there was some level of anthophyllite asbestos that was there, much less than 1%, and I don't think many people are going to be inhaling crayons.
Eating them, yes, but inhaling them, no. Okay. I don't know if we have the, you have a question?
Just to follow on that, is there any danger of eating of the asbestos fibers getting into the gastrointestinal tract and causing damage?
Did everyone hear that? The question is about, a process not of inhalation, but of eating asbestos fibers, ingesting them.
The Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry publishes a book that's called Toxicological Profiles. And if you look in the toxicological profiles put out on asbestos, there are several articles in there that they refer to where people have developed gastrointestinal, namely colon cancers and renal cancers that had high exposures to asbestos. And the question is brought up, but not proven by any stretch of the imagination, whether they ingested it and it caused it locally there in some individuals that may be more susceptible than others to this. But as a direct relationship, no one knows. But because there is literature that would hint towards this, it's certainly a question that needs to be further asked.
there was a great deal of research done on ingested asbestos using animal studies 20, 25 years ago, and they did find that the asbestos that was ingested could transmigrate, that is, go across the intestinal submucosa and enter the bloodstream, and once it gets there, it can go anywhere it wants to. And as a matter of fact, Phil Cook with the US EPA in Minnesota Duluth, when the taconite tailings were a hot topic, he looked at people who were drinking straight Lake Superior water, unfiltered water, back in the late 70s. The water had lots of taconite tailings, and taconite is very similar to asbestos in many ways. And he looked at the urine of these people, and the taconite tailings were in the urine of the people, versus the control group who were using well water and had no taconite tailings in the urine. So we do know that the asbestos can, through ingestion in the GI system, pass into the blood. But the evidence for cancers, as you said, is anecdotal rather than proven statistically.
I addressed this question on the internet about 6 months ago. I did a Google search and I put in asbestosis and colon cancer. And the first 20 hits I got on the internet were all law firms saying, yes, there is an association. As I went through all of the hits, I could not find one single peer-reviewed paper from a medical journal that stated there was a relationship.
Thank goodness we have people that research beyond the bounds of Google, right? This is one of my questions. Can we look to the future and think about whether EPA and OSHA will ever distinguish between fiber types, amphiboles and serpentine, in their regulations? Does anybody have the crystal ball for EPA and OSHA on that one? Okay, well, then I'll throw out one more that was on my list, and I think there might be somebody out there who has some evidence on this one. Can we look forward to a time where EPA will change the prescribed analytical methodology for sampling bulk samples from PLM to something more specific, at least for vermiculite, or for amphiboles?
I'll just say that I hope so. There have been a lot of advances in the types of analysis that are done, and the EPA is composed of scientists just like other facilities, and scientists have this quest to keep moving things forward and moving the science forward and making improvements and doing it better, faster, and more reliably. So I envision the fact that they will move forward, and once any type of further analysis has been conclusively demonstrated to be accurate and reproducible and sensitive, I'm sure they'll move on.
Before Jim goes, I think the Libby situation has taught us a couple of things. One is that standardized methodology initially in Libby, at least if I remember the story right, missed the fibers. And so we're learning to revise our standards and our analytical techniques to fit a larger set of amphiboles. And then I'll pass the mic.
Well, actually, the EPA has come up with a methodology specific for vermiculite. Vermiculite attic insulation. We had a couple of meetings, one in Cincinnati 2 years ago and a follow-up in Alexandria a year ago. And a method was developed. It's called the Cincinnati method, and you can go to the EPA website and find it if you look for vermiculite attic insulation. And it goes in a stratified approach. First of all, you use a stereo microscope and look for the big clunkers of asbestos. They're very easy to see, usually in the Libby stuff. You pull them out, you do a gravimetric analysis, and you stop because it's there at high concentration. If you don't see it there, then you have the vermiculite that you've already run through some water. You've got the rinse water, and you look at that by TEM. So there is a method where you can look at the vermiculite at several levels of intensity to see whether it is there or not, and at what concentration.
And I just might add that part of the whole issue is how this sample is collected. Techniques that were used 15 years ago for sampling vermiculite were just go in there and grab a sample of it. Now they have a sort of a stratified approach to sampling and getting the fines that are at the bottom that settle out. And typically this is attic insulation that we're talking about.
My name's John Podolinsky. I'm with the Department of Environmental Quality, and I run the asbestos program, and I get that question asked almost every day, probably a half a dozen times. And we wrestle with it an awful lot because as an administrator of regulations, and as somebody mentioned up here earlier, an asbestos-containing material is anything that contains more than 1% asbestos. With vermiculite, in a lot of cases, you don't find the asbestos associated with vermiculite, especially the vermiculite from Libby, because it is so small, using polarized light microscopy techniques, as well as a sample preparation. The state is going through a rule rewrite, and one of the sections in there is to acknowledge other types of analysis. Right now, the only analysis that the state of Montana, as well as EPA, at least in the National Emission Standards for Hazardous Air Pollutants, recognizes is polarized light microscopy. And in fact, there's even a regulation within the NESHAP regulation that requires point counting of materials that contain 10% or less asbestos. But with vermiculite, when you use this point counting methodology, a lot of times the vermiculite flecks block out the ability for the microscopist to actually see the asbestos fibers. So we've had instances where vermiculite has been removed in a manner that's not been safe or protective of the health. And we're trying to address that issue, but as a state agent, we can only do what's legally able to be done. And in some cases, that can be very frustrating. I wanted to touch base earlier. Somebody talked about, we got onto the ban and phase-out issue whether or not there's substitute materials out there to replace asbestos fibers. Back in 1989, EPA made a move to ban all uses of asbestos. In 1991, that ban was remanded. So there's still a lot of products out there that you and I can go out and purchase. Primarily those materials are floor coverings like linoleum, floor tile, some glues, caulkings, roofing products, new uses of asbestos, and a host of other materials. And a big thrust of our program is to educate as many people about that particular issue. We're currently making roofing products down in Arizona, so we're bringing in amounts of asbestos from Canada as well as around the world, and still making products that contain asbestos. A lot of people are ignorant of the fact of that, and again, education is going to be one of those things that combats that issue, and we hopefully will stop this evil cycle, or this cycle of people being exposed to asbestos and needing treatment. So it's one of those things that if you think that we're out of the woods, we're not. And that comes from somebody who's been in the industry for quite a long time. Thank you.
Stay here just for a moment, because another question we had was, how can we work towards a ban on asbestos in this country? You may have already answered that in education.
Senator Patty Murray, I believe her name is, over in Washington, has been working on this for quite some time. It seems that Congress always wants to put her bill with other bills that aren't so friendly about protecting people from asbestos exposures. So there's a lot of politics involved in this particular issue. But certainly people can address or go to their local legislators and address this kind of issue as well. It certainly would be fantastic if the state of Montana took a little more initiative to address some of these questions and actually come up with answers toward them. In a lot of cases, we look to EPA and the federal government to answer those problems or those questions, but I think that in some cases the state should step forward and do some of that work. Did I answer the question sufficiently?
Anybody else have thoughts on how we can work together towards banning the use of asbestos?
Go to the polls.
Go to the polls, right. Yeah, that's partly, that's a big part of why the ban was rescinded. Exactly, yeah. What is the minimum number of asbestos fibers, and it says crucidolite, required to begin the fibrotic process in humans? What then is a safe level of fibers for us to breathe? Okay. It was, yeah, it was not specific to crucidolite. Okay. Those are all the questions that we have on cards, but I bet that there are some more questions out there. We have about 20 to 25 minutes. No, okay. Do we? Oh, okay. So we'll take one more.
I heard a statement earlier today that one of the reasons that we've made so much progress in HIV disease was that because tons of money had been thrown at it. If all the money available that you wanted could be given to you to work in asbestos-related research, where would you initiate your interest and your focus? Would it be towards a cure? Would it be towards prevention? Or would it be towards some other aspect, mechanisms?
I'll be foolish enough to take a first stab at that one. I believe it would be towards basic mechanisms, because out of understanding basic mechanisms could come the possibility for developing treatments or cures, and you could also then develop the rationale for proposing prevention. So I think, of course I'm coming at it from the perspective of a basic scientist, but for me, that's where it starts. I mean, I got my training in a cancer hospital, MD Anderson Cancer Center, and one of the questions that was always raised was, why is somebody studying transcription or translation? There's some very basic research in the cancer hospital instead of working on therapies, and it's because if you don't understand the building blocks of what's going on, you can't understand the entire building, and you can't figure out a way to make it safe and prop it up and fix it when it's wrong. So part of basic research would be going towards understanding where things go wrong so that you can fix them so that they're right. That comes into therapeutics, the development of new, maybe the medicinal chemists come up with a new medication that will help people's symptoms. I think we deal with a really unique problem with asbestos because a lot of times, if you're a surgeon, when in doubt, cut it out. You remove the cause of the problem. There's no way to get the asbestos out of our bodies once it's there. So I think that if we understand the processes of disease development and the multitude of diseases that we've already talked about, then I think we can design ways to interrupt those processes and give better quality of life to people.
Well, Mike did say that there's an unlimited supply of money, so I suggest we work on the prevention as well. When I was in college, I was very impressed by one professor who said those working in cancer research should be better spending their time getting carcinogens out of the market. If you stop the source of the problem will eventually taper off and go away. And I believe that's the case here. The ban is a critical thing, but it doesn't help the people who are affected now. So mechanism is as well crucial, and since we have all the money, I think both would be the flippant answer.
I actually want to address the question that whether one fibers is already too much. One of the questions that was asked previously was that is one fiber enough to induce any fibrotic disease? And because asbestos is ubiquitous in the environment, and quite often, if you get a lung tissue sample from an urban members of the community, for example, in New York City, or in any other big city, you are very likely to find in their lung tissues fibers, asbestos fibers. And yet, many of them, they don't really develop any tumors or any other untoward side effects. And so studies by the late Irvin Silikoff, in his opinion, he would argue adamantly, just one fiber is one fiber too many. Okay, and so there's a very diverse in opinions to whether there is indeed a threshold. But based on all the laboratory studies and based on the cell culture work that has been conducted so far, if you were to compare the number of fibers, it's not the numbers per se, it is the type of fibers. They have to fit the aspect ratios, they have to have long durabilities, and so there's very other factors that come into play. Another possibility is that individuals are different in their genetic response to toxicants, and just like tobacco smoke, if 100 people smoke, only 10 of them will develop lung cancers. What happened to the other 99? And so this gene-environment interaction issue also happens to be an important aspect in this regard.
Thank you. Okay, I believe this concludes our Ask the Experts. And many of you will have an opportunity in the session to continue asking questions. But thanks to the others of you for coming out today.